Michael Torres thought he was coming home to close a chapter forever, but his faithful companion Scout had other plans entirely. When the German shepherd refused every command and led him to an abandoned shed behind the family farmhouse, Michael discovered something that would shatter everything he believed about the man who raised him. What Scout uncovered in that forgotten corner of his childhood would reveal a truth so profound it would rewrite 20 years of bitter memories and change the course of his life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, cutting through the mechanical silence of Michael's sparse apartment like a blade through paper. He had been assembling his service weapon on the kitchen table, the familiar ritual of cleaning and maintenance that anchored him to routine in the shapeless days of civilian life. The metallic scent of gun oil and the precise clicking of components sliding into place were among the few things that still made sense to him. The phone's harsh ring violated the careful quiet he had cultivated around himself. He let it ring 3 times before answering, his voice carrying the flat, neutral tone he had perfected during 12 years of military service. "Torres, Michael, son, this is Father Martinez from St. Catherine's Parish." The voice was weathered and gentle, carrying the weight of delivering news that couldn't wait for a better time. "I'm calling about your father, Roberto. I'm afraid he passed away yesterday evening. His heart gave out while he was working in the barn." "I'm so sorry, Michael." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Michael sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the disassembled pistol, feeling nothing at all. No shock, no grief, no relief. Just the same hollow emptiness that had become his constant companion since returning from overseas. "I see," he said finally, the response automatic and meaningless. "The funeral arrangements are being handled through Henderson's funeral home," Father Martinez continued, his voice careful and kind. "But someone needs to take care of the property, Michael. You're his only family left. Thank you for calling, Father. I'll handle it. He spoke of you often, you know." He was proud. Michael disconnected the call with a quiet click, placing the phone back in its cradle with deliberate precision. He stared at the weapon parts scattered across the table, his mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive in hostile territories. This was simply another mission: pack the essentials, secure transportation, complete the objective, and return to base, clean and efficient. He began reassembling the pistol with practiced movements, each component sliding into place with mechanical certainty. Roberto Torres was dead. The man who had raised him with iron discipline and crushing silence had finally succumbed to the weak heart that Michael had never known existed. There would be paperwork to sign, property to liquidate, and loose ends to tie up. Then he could return to his carefully ordered solitude and put Nebraska behind him forever. The drive from Colorado to the small farming community of Cedar Falls, Nebraska, stretched across 2 days of endless highway and unchanging landscape. Michael's only companion was Scout, a 5-year-old German shepherd who had served alongside him as a military working dog in Afghanistan. The animal sat in the passenger seat of the pickup truck, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the road ahead, his breathing steady and calm. Scout was the only living creature Michael had allowed himself to care about since his discharge 3 years earlier. The dog had been retired from service due to a shrapnel injury to his left rear leg, leaving him with a slight limp but otherwise undiminished in his loyalty and alertness. Like Michael, Scout was a professional warrior adapting to civilian life, and they understood each other in ways that required no words. The miles dissolved beneath the truck's tires as they drove through the heart of America, past grain elevators and farmhouses that dotted the landscape like forgotten prayers. Michael drove with focused intensity, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he could outdistance the memories that began to stir as they approached familiar territory. He had left Cedar Falls 20 years ago at 18, enlisting in the Army the day after graduating from high school. It had not been a decision born of patriotic fervor or family tradition. It had been an escape, pure and simple, from a house where silence was a weapon and disappointment hung in the air like dust motes in stagnant light. Roberto Torres had been a hard man, forged by his own difficult childhood and shaped by the relentless demands of working a farm that barely provided enough income to survive. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles, who believed that love was demonstrated through discipline and that weakness was the greatest sin a father could allow in his son. Michael's memories of his childhood were painted in shades of brown and grey, like old photographs left too long in sunlight. He remembered the pre-dawn chores, the silent breakfasts, the evening meals where the only sounds were the scraping of forks against plates and the distant lowing of cattle. Roberto had run the farm with military precision, and Michael had been just another soldier in his father's one-man army. The breaking point had come during Michael's senior year of high school. He had been caught drinking beer with friends behind the old grain elevator, a minor act of teenage rebellion that Roberto had treated like a capital offense. The confrontation that followed had been brief but devastating. Roberto's fury had been cold and contained, more terrifying than if he had raged and shouted. He had grounded Michael for the remainder of the school year, confined him to the farm like a prisoner, and spoken to him only when absolutely necessary. That night, lying in his narrow bed and staring at the ceiling, Michael had made his decision. He would finish school, and then he would leave Cedar Falls forever. The army recruiter who visited the high school the following week had seemed like a messenger from another world, offering structure, purpose, and most importantly, distance from the suffocating atmosphere of the Torres farm. Roberto had said nothing when Michael announced his enlistment. He had simply nodded once, a gesture that Michael had interpreted as relief rather than approval. The old man was finally rid of his disappointment of a son, free to run his farm without the burden of trying to make something worthwhile out of damaged goods. As the landscape outside the truck windows became increasingly familiar, Michael felt the old tightness returning to his chest. The rolling hills covered in winter wheat, the red barns weathered by decades of prairie wind, the narrow gravel roads that connected one small farm to another. This was the world he had fled from, and now he was returning to bury its king. Scout stirred in the passenger seat, lifting his head to sniff the air flowing through the slightly open window. The dog's ears perked forward, and his tail gave a single tentative wag. Even after 20 years, some part of him recognized this place as home. Michael reached over and rested his hand on Scout's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's fur beneath his fingers. "Just a quick operation, boy," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "In and out, then we're gone." The Torres farm sat on 200 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, 8 miles outside Cedar Falls proper. The property had been in the family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. Michael's great-grandfather had built the original farmhouse in 1924, a simple 2-story structure designed for function rather than beauty. Over the decades, subsequent generations had added onto it, creating a rambling collection of rooms and outbuildings that told the story of a family's attempt to thrive in an unforgiving landscape. As Michael turned the truck onto the familiar gravel driveway, the sight of the farmhouse hit him like a physical blow. It looked exactly as it had 20 years earlier, as if time had simply stopped the day he left. The white paint was more faded now, and a few shingles had come loose from the roof, but the essential character of the place remained unchanged. It was still the same stern, uncompromising structure that had housed 3 generations of Torres men, each one harder than the last. The barn stood behind the house, a massive red structure that had been the true heart of the operation. Michael could see that the paint was peeling, and some of the boards had warped with age, but the building still radiated the sense of stubborn permanence that Roberto had valued above all else. This was where his father had spent most of his waking hours, tending to the cattle and equipment that had consumed his life. Michael parked the truck near the front porch and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Scout whined softly, sensing his master's tension. The dog's brown eyes were fixed on Michael's face, reading the micro-expressions that betrayed the carefully controlled exterior. "All right," Michael said finally, opening the truck door. "Let's get this over with." The key to the front door was hidden in the same place it had always been, tucked beneath a loose board on the porch steps. Some traditions, apparently, were stronger than death. Michael retrieved it and unlocked the door, Scout padding silently behind him. The interior of the house was a museum of his childhood, preserved in amber. The same threadbare sofa sat in the living room, facing the same old television set. The same faded photographs lined the mantelpiece, documenting the Torres family history in sepia tones and black and white. His mother's portrait still held the place of honor in the center, a young woman with kind eyes who had died when Michael was 12, leaving father and son to navigate the remainder of his childhood alone. The silence in the house was different from the careful quiet of his apartment. This silence was heavy and expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Michael walked slowly through the rooms, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, Scout's claws clicking softly behind him. Everything was exactly as he remembered it, down to the stack of farm journals on the kitchen table and the coffee mug sitting beside the sink. It was as if Roberto had simply stepped outside for a moment and would return at any second, demanding to know what his prodigal son was doing in his house. Michael's plan was methodical and efficient, the same approach he had used when clearing buildings in hostile territory. He would spend 3 days inventorying the property, contact a lawyer to handle the legal aspects of the estate, and arrange for an auction company to dispose of the farm equipment and household goods. The property itself would go on the market immediately. Within a month, his connection to Cedar Falls would be severed forever. He dropped his duffel bag in his old bedroom, a small space under the eaves that had changed not at all since his departure. The same narrow bed, the same plain wooden desk, the same window that looked out over the fields where he had worked as a boy. The room felt like a shrine to a person he no longer was, preserved by a man who had never understood him. Scout explored the house with professional thoroughness, his nose working constantly as he processed the complex layers of scent that told the story of the place. The dog's behavior was different here, more alert and focused than Michael had seen him since their return to civilian life. Something about the farm had awakened the working dog's instincts, though Michael couldn't imagine what. As the sun began to set over the Nebraska prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Michael stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the land that had shaped his father's life. The fields stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional line of trees or the distant silhouette of a neighbor's barn. It was a landscape of vast emptiness and subtle beauty, the kind of place that either claimed a man's soul or drove him to seek his fortune elsewhere. He had chosen elsewhere, and he had never regretted that decision. The army had given him structure, purpose, and the chance to prove himself in ways that had nothing to do with his ability to milk cows or repair tractors.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had been good at soldiering, rising through the ranks and earning the respect of his peers and superiors. The farm had never offered him that kind of validation. Scout appeared at his side, the dog's presence warm and reassuring in the growing darkness. Michael reached down and scratched behind the German shepherd's ears, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Tomorrow we start clearing this place out," he told the dog. "Then we can go home." But even as he spoke the words, Michael wondered where exactly home was. His apartment in Colorado was just a place to sleep between odd jobs and VA appointments. The farm had never felt like home either, just a place where he had served time until he was old enough to leave. Perhaps home was simply wherever Scout was, the only relationship in his life that made sense anymore. The first night in the farmhouse passed restlessly. Michael lay in his old bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the prairie night. The wind through the wheat fields, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak and settle of old wood. These were the lullabies of his childhood, as familiar as his own heartbeat, but they brought no comfort now. Scout had claimed a spot on the braided rug beside the bed, his breathing deep and even. The dog seemed more at peace here than Michael had seen him in months, as if some part of his canine soul recognized this as the kind of place where he was meant to be.
Working dogs, Michael knew, were happiest when they had a job to do and territory to protect. The farm offered both in abundance. When dawn broke over the Nebraska horizon, Michael rose with the sun as he had been trained to do both by the army and by his father. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to make coffee, Scout trailing behind him with the quiet alertness that had made him such an effective military working dog. The kitchen looked different in the morning light, less like a preserved museum and more like the simple workspace it had always been. Roberto had been a man of basic needs and plain habits, and the kitchen reflected that philosophy. A few simple appliances, sturdy furniture built to last, and everything kept in its proper place. It was the kitchen of a man who viewed cooking as fuel rather than art, eating as necessity rather than pleasure. Michael found an unopened bag of coffee in the pantry and brewed a pot, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen with warmth. As he waited for it to finish, he walked to the window that looked out over the barnyard and the fields beyond. The morning was clear and cold, with frost glittering on the fence posts and the breath of the remaining cattle visible in small puffs of vapor. This was the view that had greeted Roberto every morning for 40 years, the landscape that had defined his world and shaped his character. Michael tried to imagine what it would have been like to wake up to the same sight every day for 4 decades, to find purpose and meaning in the endless cycle of planting and harvesting, feeding and tending. It seemed like a kind of prison to him, but perhaps for Roberto it had been freedom. Scout's behavior had grown increasingly strange since their arrival at the farm. The dog was restless in a way that was entirely unlike his usual disciplined demeanor. He would settle for a few minutes, then rise and pace to the window, his ears erect and his nose working the air. When Michael let him outside, Scout would stand in the yard and stare intently at something beyond the visible horizon, his entire body tense with anticipation. "What is it, boy?" Michael asked, but the dog offered no explanation, just continued his restless vigil. After breakfast, Michael began his systematic inventory of the house, working room by room with military precision. The living room yielded little of value beyond a few pieces of furniture that might attract buyers at an estate sale. Roberto had not been a collector or a keeper of mementos. His possessions reflected the same stark functionality as his personality. The dining room contained a simple oak table and chairs, a china cabinet that held everyday dishes rather than family heirlooms, and a few landscape paintings that had probably come with the house decades earlier. Michael packed what little might have sentimental or monetary value into cardboard boxes, marking each one with careful labels. It was methodical, emotionless work, exactly the kind of task that suited his temperament. He was not excavating memories or mourning the end of an era. He was simply processing inventory, reducing a lifetime's accumulation to manageable categories that could be efficiently disposed of. Scout, however, seemed to have other ideas about the day's priorities. The dog had abandoned his usual practice of staying close to Michael's side, instead conducting his own thorough investigation of the property. He would disappear for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, returning with burrs in his coat and dirt on his paws, his expression intent and purposeful. By mid-afternoon, Michael had cleared the main floor of the house and moved upstairs to tackle the bedrooms. His parents' room was a Spartan chamber that reflected Roberto's monastic approach to personal comfort. The bed was a simple double with a plain wooden headboard, the dresser was functional rather than decorative, and the closet contained work clothes that had been mended and remended rather than replaced. Going through his father's personal effects was like reading the biography of a stranger. Roberto's wallet contained exactly what Michael expected: a driver's license, insurance cards, and $37 in cash. No photographs, no credit cards, no membership cards for organizations or clubs. It was the wallet of a man whose life had been reduced to its most essential elements. The dresser drawers revealed similar austerity: work shirts, heavy denim jeans, thermal underwear, and thick socks. Everything was neatly folded and arranged with military precision, though Roberto had never served in the armed forces. It was simply the way he approached everything in his life, with discipline and order. Michael found himself searching for something, though he couldn't have said what. Some personal touch, some glimpse of the man behind the facade, some evidence that Roberto Torres had been more than just a farming machine powered by duty and determination. But the search yielded nothing. His father had been exactly what he appeared to be, a hard man who had lived a hard life and left behind nothing but the fruits of his labor. Scout's restlessness had escalated throughout the day, and by evening the dog was practically vibrating with contained energy. He would lie down for a few minutes, then spring to his feet and pace to the door, whining softly. When Michael let him out, Scout would bolt across the yard toward the cluster of outbuildings behind the house, only to return 10 minutes later, his expression frustrated and urgent. "What's gotten into you?" Michael asked, but Scout only stared at him with those intelligent brown eyes, as if trying to communicate something that transcended the barrier of species. As darkness fell over the farm, Michael made a simple dinner from canned goods he found in the pantry. He ate without tasting, his mind already focused on the next day's tasks. The house was nearly finished, and then he could move on to the barn and the equipment shed. Another day or two of steady work, and he would be ready to contact the professionals who would handle the final disposition of the property. Scout had finally settled beside his chair, but the dog's ears remained erect, constantly swiveling toward sounds that Michael couldn't detect. The German shepherd's alertness was infectious, and Michael found himself listening for whatever had captured Scout's attention. But the night sounds of the farm were the same ones he remembered from childhood: wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the grass. After dinner, Michael walked out onto the front porch, Scout at his side. The night sky above Nebraska was a vast tapestry of stars, unmarred by the light pollution that had become his norm in more populated areas. He had forgotten how magnificent the night sky could be out here, how the darkness revealed wonders that were invisible in the city. Standing there on the porch where he had spent countless evenings as a boy, Michael felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been nostalgia. Not for his father or for the difficult relationship they had shared, but for the simple reality of this place. The farm possessed a kind of honest permanence that was absent from his current life. Everything here had a purpose, a function, a reason for existing. It was the opposite of the rootless, temporary existence he had built for himself. Scout suddenly lifted his head, his ears pointing toward the cluster of buildings behind the house. The dog's entire body had gone rigid, and a low whine escaped his throat. Michael followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual in the darkness. "Easy, boy," he murmured, but Scout paid no attention to the command. The dog descended the porch steps and walked purposefully toward the outbuildings, his movements controlled but urgent. Michael retrieved a flashlight from the truck and followed, curious despite himself about what had captured Scout's attention so completely. The beam of light revealed the familiar collection of structures that had housed the farm's operations for decades. The main barn, a smaller equipment shed, a grain storage building, and at the far edge of the cluster, a small windowless building that Roberto had always referred to simply as the old shed. Scout headed directly for the old shed, his nose working frantically at the base of the heavy wooden door. The building had been locked for as long as Michael could remember, Roberto claiming it contained nothing but broken equipment and old chemicals that were too dangerous to move. It had been one of the few places on the farm that was strictly off-limits, and Michael had learned early not to ask questions about its contents. The dog began to scratch at the door, his claws leaving fresh gouges in the weathered wood. His whining had become more insistent, almost frantic, and he kept looking back at Michael with an expression that was unmistakably urgent. "Scout, heel," Michael commanded, but the dog ignored him completely. In all their years together, through the chaos of combat and the challenges of civilian life, Scout had never ignored a direct command. The German shepherd was a professional, trained to follow orders without question. His current behavior was so out of character that it sent a chill down Michael's spine. Michael approached the shed and examined the heavy padlock that secured the door. It was old but sturdy, the kind of lock that would require bolt cutters to remove. He knocked on the door experimentally and was surprised to hear a hollow echo from within. Whatever was inside, it wasn't taking up much space. Scout had moved to the side of the building, working his nose along the base of the wall. The dog's excitement was palpable now, his entire body trembling with barely contained energy. He looked back at Michael again, his eyes bright and urgent in the flashlight beam. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Michael found himself walking back to the equipment shed to retrieve the bolt cutters he had seen hanging on the wall. Roberto's prohibition against entering the old shed had been one of the few absolute rules on the farm, and breaking it felt like a transgression of the highest order. But Scout's behavior had awakened something in Michael, a curiosity that was stronger than his respect for his dead father's wishes. The bolt cutters made short work of the old padlock, which fell to the ground with a metallic clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Michael hesitated for a moment, his hand on the door handle, then pulled it open. The smell that emerged from the shed was not what he expected. Instead of the musty odor of abandonment or the chemical tang of pesticides, there was something else entirely, something clean and dry, with hints of sawdust and varnish. It was the smell of careful work and patient craft, completely at odds with the building's neglected exterior. Scout pushed past him into the darkness, his tail wagging for the first time since their arrival at the farm. Michael followed, sweeping the flashlight beam across the interior of the shed, and what he saw there stopped him in his tracks. The old shed was not a storage building at all.
It was a workshop, meticulously organized and lovingly maintained. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces clear and clean. Hand tools hung from pegboards in perfect rows, each one in its designated place. A collection of wood carving knives lay arranged in order of size, their blades gleaming despite the dust that covered everything else. But it was the objects on the shelves that truly captured Michael's attention. Dozens of wooden figures, carved with extraordinary skill and attention to detail. Birds in flight, horses at gallop, farm animals in pastoral poses. Each one was a masterpiece of folk art, capturing not just the physical form of the subject, but somehow its essential spirit as well. Michael moved slowly through the workshop, his flashlight beam revealing wonder after wonder. There were toys that had never been played with, decorative boxes that had never been opened, sculptures that had never been displayed. An entire secret life's work, hidden away in a building that the world believed contained nothing but junk. Scout had found something in the far corner of the shed, a larger object covered by a paint-stained canvas tarp. The dog was pawing at the covering, whining with excitement. Michael walked over and pulled away the tarp, revealing what lay beneath. It was a cradle, hand-carved from rich cherry wood and inlaid with intricate patterns of lighter maple. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each joint perfect, each curve flowing naturally into the next. But like so many of the other pieces in the workshop, it was unfinished. The headboard was only partially carved, its design sketched in pencil but never completed. Michael stared at the cradle, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was the work of an artist, someone with not just skill but vision and patience. The man who had created these things possessed a sensitivity and creativity that was the complete opposite of the Roberto Torres that Michael remembered. He found a light switch near the door and was surprised when overhead fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing the workshop in stark detail. Everything was exactly as it had appeared in the flashlight beam, but somehow more real and more impossible. This place existed, this secret world that contradicted everything Michael thought he knew about his father. Scout had claimed a spot near the workbench, lying down with his head on his paws, finally at peace.
The dog's eyes were fixed on Michael, as if to say, "I brought you here. Now what are you going to do about it?" Michael walked slowly around the workshop, touching nothing but observing everything. The tools were of professional quality, many of them obviously handmade. The wood stock was carefully selected and properly stored. The unfinished pieces showed evidence of meticulous planning and patient execution. This was not the hobby of a weekend dabbler, but the serious pursuit of a master craftsman. In a corner of the workshop, he discovered a small desk with a leather-bound notebook lying open on its surface. The pages were covered with sketches and notes, written in his father's familiar handwriting, but revealing a side of the man that Michael had never imagined existed. Designs for toys and furniture, observations about wood grain and finishing techniques, and scattered throughout the technical notes, brief personal comments that seemed to be addressed to no one in particular. Maria always loved the smell of cherry wood, read one entry, said it reminded her of her grandmother's house in Mexico. Maria, his mother's name. Michael had not heard Roberto speak it aloud since the funeral 20 years earlier. He turned the pages of the notebook, reading entry after entry that revealed a man in conversation with his own memories and dreams. The technical observations were interspersed with personal reflections that painted a picture of someone far more complex and emotionally rich than the stern farmer Michael remembered. "The boy used to watch me work on the tractor," read another entry. "Always asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Wish I could have found better words." The boy, that would be him. Michael realized with a shock that felt like a physical blow. Roberto had been thinking about him, remembering their interactions, wishing for something different. The man who had seemed so cold and distant had been observing, remembering, caring in ways that he had never been able to express. Michael sank into the chair beside the desk, the notebook trembling in his hands. 20 years of certainty about his father and their relationship was crumbling like a house built on sand. The man he had fled from, the cold disciplinarian who had made his childhood a series of tests he could never pass, had possessed this entire hidden world of creativity and sensitivity. Scout rose from his spot by the workbench and came to rest his head on Michael's knee, the dog's brown eyes reflecting the understanding that came from shared service in difficult circumstances. They had both been soldiers, he and Scout, trained to read situations and respond to threats. But this was not a threat they were facing. This was something far more complex and emotionally challenging. Michael looked around the workshop again, seeing it now not as a collection of abandoned projects, but as a love letter written in wood and never delivered. Every carved figure, every carefully planned design, every patient hour spent in solitude and creation was evidence of a soul that Roberto had never been able to share with the world. The cradle in the corner drew his attention again, its unfinished state somehow more poignant than if it had been completed. It was obviously intended for a grandchild, created in hope and anticipation of a future that had never materialized. Michael had never married, never had children, never given Roberto the continuation of the family line that the old man must have longed for. He rose from the chair and walked to the cradle, running his hand over the smooth, sanded surface. The wood was warm to the touch, as if it retained some of the life and love that had shaped it. For the first time since receiving news of his father's death, Michael felt something other than emptiness. It was not grief exactly, but a profound sense of loss for something he had never known existed. The workshop represented everything that Roberto Torres had been but could never express. It was his church, his sanctuary, his means of communication with a world that he found difficult to navigate with words. And Michael, in his rush to escape and his certainty that he understood his father completely, had never even known it existed. Scout settled beside the cradle, his mission apparently complete. The dog had led Michael to the discovery that would change everything, and now it was up to his master to decide what to do with the truth he had uncovered. The German shepherd's expression was patient and expectant, as if he understood that this moment was a turning point that would define everything that came after. Michael stood in the silence of the workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had never found its voice, and wondered what other secrets lay buried in the life of the man he had thought he knew so well. The carefully constructed narrative of his childhood had been built on assumptions and misunderstandings, and now that foundation was gone. In its place was something far more complex and heartbreaking, the knowledge that Roberto Torres had been a man capable of great beauty and profound feeling, trapped within a personality that could not express what mattered most. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the carved figures seem to move in the periphery of vision. Michael felt as if he was standing at the edge of a vast chasm that separated his old understanding of his life from whatever truth lay waiting on the other side. Scout's discovery had opened a door that could never be closed again, and there was no way forward except to walk through it and face whatever revelations lay beyond. The harsh fluorescent light revealed every detail of Roberto's secret world with unforgiving clarity. Michael spent the next hour moving through the workshop like an investigator at a crime scene, documenting evidence of a life he had never suspected existed. Each carved animal, each carefully planned furniture design, each notation in the leather notebook built a case against everything he thought he understood about his father. Scout remained near the unfinished cradle, his earlier agitation replaced by a calm watchfulness. The German shepherd seemed to understand that his job was complete. He had delivered his master to this moment of revelation, and now Michael had to decide what to do with the truth that lay scattered across every surface of the hidden workshop. The notebook drew Michael back repeatedly as he explored. Roberto's handwriting filled page after page with observations that painted a portrait of a man wrestling with emotions he could never speak aloud. Technical notes about wood grain and joint construction were interspersed with fragments of memory and regret that read like entries in a diary he never intended anyone to see. Started the rocking horse today. Michael used to love horses when he was small, always drew pictures of them in the margins of his school papers. Don't know if he remembers that now. Michael stopped breathing. He did remember. The horses had been his constant companions throughout elementary school, filling the borders of homework assignments and test papers. He had drawn them galloping through fields, standing proud in pastures, carrying imaginary riders on adventures that existed only in his young mind. He had assumed his father never noticed those drawings, never cared about the fantasies they represented. The revelation that Roberto had not only noticed but remembered and been inspired by them felt like discovering a hidden room in his own heart. He turned more pages, each entry deepening the mystery of the man who had raised him. Roberto wrote about the weather, about the challenges of farming, about the loneliness that seemed to permeate his days. But threaded through the practical observations were glimpses of a soul that yearned for connection and beauty in ways he had never been able to express. The boy came home from school today with paint under his fingernails. Art class, I think. Maria would have asked him about it, would have hung his pictures on the refrigerator. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, same as always. Michael closed his eyes, remembering that day with perfect clarity. He had been 10 years old, excited about a watercolor painting of a sunset he had created in art class. He had wanted to show Roberto, had hoped for some word of encouragement or approval. Instead, his father had glanced at the painting for exactly 3 seconds before returning his attention to the farm supply catalog he was reading. Michael had crumpled the painting and thrown it away, interpreting the silence as indifference. Now he understood that Roberto's silence had been the paralysis of a man who desperately wanted to connect but possessed no vocabulary for tenderness. The gruff farmer who seemed so confident in every other aspect of his life became helpless when faced with the simple task of encouraging his artistic son. The workshop told the same story in 3 dimensions. Scattered among the completed carvings were rough sketches and half-finished attempts at subjects that clearly came from Michael's childhood interests. A partially carved baseball glove, abandoned when Roberto's artistic skills proved inadequate to capture the complex geometry of leather and stitching. A series of toy soldiers in various stages of completion, their uniforms and weapons rendered with painstaking attention to detail that spoke of hours spent researching military history. Michael picked up one of the soldier figures, a Civil War infantryman carved from basswood and painted with acrylics. The detail was extraordinary, from the buttons on the uniform to the expression of quiet determination on the miniature face. This was not the work of a casual hobbyist, but of someone who had invested serious time and effort in developing his craft.
He found himself searching for clues about when Roberto had begun this secret artistic life. The earliest dates in the notebook went back nearly 15 years, well after Michael had left for the army. It was as if Roberto had discovered or rediscovered his creative impulses only after his son was gone, as if the pressure of trying to be the kind of father he thought he should be had suppressed this part of his nature. The irony was devastating. Michael had fled from a man he perceived as cold and unfeeling, only to discover that his departure had somehow liberated the very qualities he had always wished his father possessed. The workshop was filled with evidence of Roberto's capacity for patience, creativity, and gentle observation. These were exactly the traits that would have made him a better father, but they had emerged only in the silence and solitude that followed Michael's escape. A wooden filing cabinet in one corner of the workshop yielded another surprise. The drawers were filled with manila folders, each one labeled and organized with the same methodical precision that Roberto had brought to farm management. But these files contained something unexpected: newspaper clippings, printed articles, and handwritten notes about Michael's military career. Roberto had been following his son's service with the dedication of an intelligence analyst. He had somehow tracked down news articles about Michael's unit, had researched the conflicts and campaigns where his son had served, had even obtained copies of commendation letters and promotion announcements. The files painted a picture of a father who had never stopped caring about his son's welfare and achievements, even when that caring could not be expressed directly. One folder was labeled simply "Letters Never Sent." Michael opened it with trembling hands and found draft after draft of correspondence that Roberto had written but never mailed. The letters spanned the entire duration of Michael's military service, from basic training through his multiple deployments to his eventual discharge. Each one had been carefully composed and then apparently rejected, filed away with the dozens of other attempts at communication that had never found their voice. The earliest letter was dated 3 months after Michael's enlistment, written on the same kind of ruled notebook paper that Roberto used for farm records. The handwriting was careful and formal, as if Roberto was composing an official document rather than a personal communication. "Dear Michael," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well and adjusting to military life. The farm is much the same as always, though I notice your absence in ways I did not expect. The morning chores take longer without your help, but it is not the extra work that troubles me. The house seems larger somehow, emptier in ways that have nothing to do with the physical space you occupied." Michael read the letter twice, then 3 times, trying to reconcile the thoughtful, articulate voice on the page with the taciturn man who had raised him. Roberto wrote about the changing seasons, about small improvements he was making to the farm, about neighbors who asked after Michael's welfare, but beneath the surface observations was an undercurrent of loss and regret that suggested a man grappling with emotions he had no practice expressing. "I know I was not the father you deserved," one paragraph continued. "Your mother had the gift for words and comfort that I have always lacked. After we lost her, I told myself that providing for you and teaching you discipline would be enough. I see now that I was wrong, but I did not know how to be anything other than what I was. I hope the army will give you the guidance and structure that I failed to provide, and that you will find your place in the world despite my shortcomings as your father." The letter had been signed but never sealed, never addressed, never sent. It was one of dozens of similar attempts, each one representing an aborted effort to bridge the gulf that had opened between father and son. Some were longer, some shorter, but all carried the same tone of regret and inadequate love that could not find its proper expression.
Michael read letter after letter, each one deepening his understanding of the complex man who had struggled to raise a son while battling his own limitations. Roberto wrote about his pride in Michael's achievements, his worry during dangerous deployments, his hope that military service would provide the sense of purpose and belonging that farm life had never offered. The letters revealed a father who had been paying attention to every detail of his son's life from a distance, caring deeply but unable to translate that caring into the kind of communication that might have healed their relationship. The final letter in the folder was dated just 6 months earlier, shortly after Michael's discharge from active duty. Roberto's handwriting was less steady in this one, the letters slightly shaky in a way that suggested either emotion or the beginning of the health problems that would eventually claim his life. "Son," this letter began, abandoning the formal salutation of the earlier attempts, "I heard through Father Martinez that you have finished your time in the army and are settling somewhere in Colorado. I do not know if you have plans to visit Nebraska, but I want you to know that you are welcome here always. The farm is still your home if you want it, though I understand that you have built a different life for yourself." The letter went on to describe changes Roberto had made to the property, improvements and repairs that suggested he had been preparing for the possibility of Michael's return. He had modernized the kitchen, updated the electrical system, and even converted one of the unused bedrooms into what he described as a place where a man might want to work on projects of his own choosing. Michael realized with a shock that Roberto had been referring to the workshop. The timing matched perfectly. His father had created this artistic sanctuary, not just as an outlet for his own creative impulses, but as a gift for the son who might someday come home. Every carefully arranged tool, every meticulously planned project, every patient hour spent carving and shaping wood had been an act of hope that Michael would eventually return and discover this different side of his father's nature. The understanding hit him like a physical blow. He sank into the chair beside the workbench, the unsent letter trembling in his hands. Roberto had not just been pursuing a hobby in this hidden room. He had been preparing for reconciliation, creating a space where father and son might finally find common ground in the language of craft and creation. The workshop was not just evidence of Roberto's artistic abilities. It was a love letter written in wood and time, waiting for a recipient who had never come home to read it. Scout rose from his position near the cradle and padded over to rest his head on Michael's knee. The dog's brown eyes held the kind of patient understanding that came from years of witnessing human pain and confusion. In the fluorescent light of the workshop, surrounded by evidence of a father's hidden love, Michael finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had lost. The grief that came was not the clean, manageable emotion he had expected when he first learned of Roberto's death. This was something far more complex and devastating. It was grief for the relationship they had never had, for the conversations that had never taken place, for the understanding that had come too late to matter. It was the particular anguish of discovering that love had been present all along, disguised in forms he had been too young and too wounded to recognize. He found himself thinking about all the times Roberto had tried to engage with him in the clumsy, indirect ways that were apparently his only means of communication. The morning when his father had quietly repaired a bicycle chain without being asked, the evening when a new book about military history had appeared on Michael's bedside table, the countless small acts of service and provision that Michael had interpreted as mere duty rather than expressions of care. Roberto had been speaking a language of love that Michael had never learned to understand. Every early morning start, every long day of physical labor, every practical lesson about responsibility and self-reliance had been his way of saying what he could never articulate directly. The man who seemed so cold and distant had been pouring his entire heart into the project of raising a son, but he had been doing so in a vocabulary that neither of them recognized as love. The workshop represented the intersection of Roberto's two great frustrations, his inability to communicate with his son and his need to create something beautiful and lasting. Here in the privacy of this hidden space, he had found a way to express both the love he felt and the regret that haunted him. Every carved figure was a conversation they had never had, Every unfinished project was a hope for future connection that had never materialized. Michael rose from the chair and walked to the corner where the cradle stood waiting. The unfinished headboard told its own story of interrupted dreams and failing health. He could see where Roberto's hands had begun to shake, where the steady control that had defined his entire life had started to abandon him. The rough, incomplete areas of carving spoke of a man racing against time to complete a gift for a grandchild who might never exist. The cruel irony was that Michael had never even told Roberto about Sarah, his brief marriage and divorce. His father had created this beautiful cradle based on nothing more than hope and the natural assumption that his son would eventually start a family. Roberto had been building a future that included grandchildren he might never meet, expressing faith in Michael's capacity for love and continuity, even when their own relationship seemed irreparably damaged. Michael ran his hand over the smooth wood of the cradle's sides, feeling the craftsmanship that had gone into every joint and curve. This was not just furniture but sculpture, created with the kind of patience and attention to detail that spoke of profound devotion. Roberto had invested months, possibly years, in this single project, working slowly and carefully to create something worthy of the grandchild he hoped would someday sleep within its embrace. The workshop held dozens of similar projects in various stages of completion, each one representing hours of solitary labor guided by love and hope rather than practical necessity. Toy horses that would never be ridden by small hands, rocking chairs that would never comfort tired bodies, decorative boxes that would never hold treasured keepsakes. It was a museum of unrealized intentions, dreams carved in wood and left waiting for recipients who would never come to claim them. Michael found himself searching for some indication of when Roberto's health had begun to fail, when the arthritis and heart problems that would eventually claim his life had started to interfere with his work. The later entries in the notebook were shorter and less detailed, the handwriting increasingly unsteady. The projects from recent months showed evidence of struggle, places where the steady precision of earlier work had given way to rougher, less controlled cuts. Hands are not what they used to be. Read one brief entry from the previous winter. The wood knows when the craftsman is failing, cannot hide weakness from oak or maple, they demand respect and steady purpose. Fear I am running out of time to finish what I started. The entry was dated just 3 months before Roberto's death. He had known his time was limited, had felt his body betraying the skills and control that had defined his artistic work. But he had continued carving and shaping, driven by some internal compulsion to complete as much as possible before the inevitable end. Michael found evidence of this final creative urgency scattered throughout the workshop. Projects that had been set aside for years had been retrieved and worked on with renewed intensity. The rocking horse that Roberto had mentioned in his early notebook entries had been dragged out of storage and nearly completed in the weeks before his death. The paint was fresh, the mane and tail carved with exquisite detail, the saddle and bridle rendered with the precision of a master craftsman working at the peak of his abilities. But even this beautiful creation carried the marks of Roberto's failing health. One stirrup was slightly uneven, a small imperfection that the younger, steadier version of himself would never have accepted. The painted eyes, while skillfully executed, showed tiny tremors in the brushwork that spoke of hands that could no longer be entirely trusted. The rocking horse stood as a monument to Roberto's refusal to surrender to physical limitations. He had pushed himself to complete this final masterpiece despite the tremors and weakness that were claiming his body. It was an act of artistic courage that spoke to the depth of his commitment to the work that had become his primary means of emotional expression. Michael lifted the rocking horse carefully, surprised by its weight and solidity. This was not a toy but an heirloom, built to last for generations and crafted with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of profound love for the child who would someday ride it. Roberto had carved initials into the base of the rocker, Mt. Michael Torres. Even in creating a gift for a hypothetical grandchild, Roberto had been thinking of his son, acknowledging the connection that linked all 3 generations.
The discovery of his own initials on the rocking horse base triggered a memory that Michael had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten its existence. He was 6 years old, running a fever and confined to bed while some childhood illness ran its course. Roberto had appeared in his doorway carrying a piece of wood and a pocket knife, settling into the chair beside Michael's bed without explanation. For the next hour, Roberto had carved while Michael watched, his fever-bright eyes fixed on his father's steady hands as they coaxed a small bird from the plain piece of pine. Roberto had worked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, a shared space where words were unnecessary. When the bird was finished, he had placed it on Michael's bedside table and left the room without ceremony.
Michael had treasured that carved bird for years, carrying it in his pocket during difficult times and sleeping with it under his pillow when nightmares made the darkness seem threatening. But somewhere in the chaos of adolescence and the urgency of escape, the bird had been lost or forgotten. Now, 20 years later, he realized that the simple act of carving had been Roberto's way of offering comfort to his sick son, a gesture of love expressed in the only language he possessed. The memory reframed everything that had come before and after. Roberto's silence had not been the absence of feeling, but the presence of emotions too deep and complex for his limited vocabulary of expression. Every practical lesson, every moment of shared work, every quiet evening spent in proximity, rather than conversation, had been his way of saying what he could never speak directly. Michael set the rocking horse down carefully and walked to the workbench where Roberto's current project lay unfinished. It was a jewelry box, carved from cherry wood and inlaid with patterns of lighter maple. The lid was partially complete, its surface decorated with a design of intertwined roses that spoke of hours of patient, detailed work. But the hinges had not been attached, and the interior compartments remained rough and unfinished. Tucked beneath the jewelry box was a small piece of paper with a woman's name written in Roberto's careful handwriting, Sarah Torres. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Somehow Roberto had known about his marriage. Despite Michael's complete silence about his personal life, despite the years of minimal contact and carefully edited conversations, his father had discovered the existence of the daughter-in-law he had never met. The jewelry box was meant for Sarah, created with the same hope and faith that had guided the construction of the cradle. Roberto had been building a relationship with a woman he had never spoken to, expressing welcome and acceptance through the medium of carved wood and patient craftsmanship. The roses on the lid were not just decoration, but symbols, chosen specifically to convey beauty and sentiment to the woman his son had chosen to marry. Michael realized that Roberto must have been devastated when the marriage ended, though he had never indicated any knowledge of either the wedding or the divorce. The unfinished state of the jewelry box suggested that news of the separation had reached him before he could complete the project, leaving him with another expression of love that would never find its intended recipient. The discovery of Sarah's name in Roberto's workshop felt like a violation of privacy so profound that Michael had to sit down to process it fully. His father had been researching his life with the dedication of a detective, gathering information about relationships and experiences that Michael had deliberately kept private. But rather than using that knowledge to interfere or judge, Roberto had simply incorporated it into his ongoing project of loving his absent son from a distance. How had he learned about Sarah? Father Martinez was the most likely source, but that meant Roberto had been actively seeking information rather than simply receiving it passively. He had cared enough to ask questions, to piece together fragments of news and rumor into a coherent picture of Michael's life beyond Nebraska. The effort required for such long-distance surveillance spoke to a level of investment and concern that contradicted everything Michael believed about his father's indifference. Scout had been watching this process of discovery with the patient attention of a therapist, his presence a calming influence in the emotionally charged atmosphere of the workshop. The dog seemed to understand that his master was undergoing a fundamental transformation, processing revelations that would reshape his understanding of himself and his history. Scout's brown eyes held no judgment, only the steady support of a companion who had witnessed worse trauma and trusted in his master's resilience. The workshop had become a courtroom where Michael was simultaneously prosecutor, defendant, and judge in a case that would determine his relationship with his own past. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Roberto Torres had been a man capable of profound love who had spent 20 years trying unsuccessfully to communicate that love to a son who was fluent only in the language of resentment and escape. The tragedy was not just that they had failed to understand each other, but that the failure had been so complete and so unnecessary. Roberto's artistic abilities, his capacity for patience and detailed observation, his deep well of unexpressed emotion, all of these qualities had been present throughout Michael's childhood. They had simply been hidden beneath a surface personality that was too damaged or too frightened to reveal itself fully. Michael found himself wondering what might have happened if Roberto had shared this workshop with him as a boy. Would they have found common ground in the shared project of creation? Could the language of craft and patience have bridged the gap that words had been unable to cross? The questions were unanswerable now, but they opened up vistas of possibility that made the actual history of their relationship seem even more tragic. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh illumination on a scene that seemed to exist outside normal time. Michael felt suspended between his old understanding of his father and some new comprehension that was still taking shape. The workshop had become a time machine, transporting him back to moments of childhood interaction that he could now see through completely different eyes. Roberto's silence, which had seemed so cold and rejecting, revealed itself as the paralysis of a man who desperately wanted to connect but possessed no vocabulary for intimacy. His focus on practical skills and physical work, which Michael had interpreted as indifference to his emotional needs, now appeared as the only means of communication available to someone whose own childhood had provided no model for tenderness or encouragement. The man who had seemed so confident in every other aspect of his life had been helpless when faced with the simple task of telling his son that he loved him. So he had built that love into fence posts and barn repairs, had embedded it in morning chores and evening lessons, had expressed it through the countless small acts of service that kept a household and a farm functioning. Roberto had been speaking constantly, but in a language that Michael had never learned to understand. The workshop represented Roberto's final attempt at communication, a last desperate effort to create something beautiful enough and meaningful enough to bridge the silence that had defined their relationship. Every carved figure, every carefully planned piece of furniture, every patient hour spent in solitary creation had been his way of saying what he could never speak directly. That his son mattered, that their relationship mattered, that love had been present all along despite the appearances that suggested otherwise. Michael stood in the center of the workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a father's hidden devotion, and felt the foundations of his adult life shifting beneath him. Everything he had built his identity upon, every decision he had made about relationships and commitment, and the possibility of lasting connection, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the most important relationship in his life. He had spent 20 years running from a man who had never stopped loving him, had built a career and a personality around the assumption that he was fundamentally unlovable, had sabotaged his own marriage because he believed he was incapable of the kind of sustained intimacy that made families possible. All of these choices had been rooted in his interpretation of Roberto's silence as rejection, rather than recognizing it as the clumsy, inadequate expression of a love too deep for words. The workshop forced him to confront not just his misunderstanding of his father, but his misunderstanding of himself. If Roberto had been capable of this level of devotion and artistic sensitivity, then perhaps Michael carried some of those same qualities within his own genetic and emotional inheritance. The capacity for patience, for detailed attention, for sustained creative work that the workshop represented might be part of his own birthright, waiting to be discovered and developed.
Scout rose from his position near the workbench and walked to the door of the workshop, looking back at Michael with an expression that seemed to suggest it was time to leave. The dog had completed his mission by bringing his master to this moment of revelation, but he also seemed to understand that too much truth at once could be overwhelming. There would be time to process everything the workshop contained, but that processing would require careful pacing and plenty of space for reflection. Michael took one final look around the hidden room that had redefined his understanding of his father and himself. The carved figures seemed to watch him with patient eyes. The unfinished projects waited for hands that would never return to complete them, and the tools hung in perfect order from their pegboards like a symphony orchestra, waiting for a conductor who would never come. He turned off the fluorescent lights and followed Scout out into the Nebraska night, pulling the door closed behind them, but he did not replace the padlock that had kept Roberto's secret for so many years. That barrier had served its purpose and was no longer needed. The workshop and all it contained now belonged to Michael, along with the responsibility for deciding what to do with the truth it had revealed. The stars above the farm were brilliant in the clear prairie sky, the same constellations that had looked down on 3 generations of Torres men as they struggled to understand themselves and each other. Michael stood in the farmyard with Scout beside him, breathing the cool night air and trying to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed to him. His original plan to liquidate the property and sever all connections to Nebraska now seemed not just wrong but impossible. How could he sell the farm when it contained this workshop filled with evidence of Roberto's hidden artistic soul? How could he dispose of the carved figures and unfinished projects that represented his father's deepest attempts at communication? The workshop was not just a collection of objects but a sacred space that demanded preservation and protection. More than that, Michael realized that he had inherited not just property but responsibility. Roberto had created this artistic legacy with the hope that his son would someday discover it and understand what it represented. Now that discovery had taken place, and with it came the obligation to honor the intention behind every carved detail and patient hour of labor. The workshop was Roberto's final gift to his son, a bequest more valuable than money or land, because it contained the key to understanding the love that had always been present but never properly expressed. Michael had spent 20 years believing he was unloved and unworthy of love, building walls around his heart to protect himself from further rejection. Now he found himself in possession of evidence that those walls had been unnecessary, that love had been there all along, waiting for him to develop the wisdom to recognize it. He walked slowly back toward the farmhouse, Scout padding silently beside him. The building looked different now, less like a prison from his past, and more like a repository of mysteries waiting to be solved. If Roberto had hidden an entire artistic life in the old shed, what other secrets might be waiting to be discovered in the rooms and spaces Michael thought he knew so well? The house no longer felt like enemy territory to be conquered and abandoned. It had become a puzzle to be solved, a relationship to be repaired, a legacy to be understood and preserved. Michael's mission had changed completely in the space of a few hours, transformed from destruction to restoration, from escape to engagement, from ending to beginning. Scout settled onto the porch steps, his duty complete but his vigilance maintained. The German shepherd had guided his master to the discovery that would change everything, and now he seemed content to wait and see what Michael would do with the truth he had been given. The dog's brown eyes reflected the starlight, patient and knowing, as if he had always understood what it would take to heal the wounds that had shaped both their lives. The morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. Michael woke before dawn, not from habit this time, but from a restlessness that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with the transformed landscape of his understanding. Scout was already awake beside the bed, his amber eyes watchful and patient, as if he too sensed that this day would be different from all the ones that had come before. Michael dressed quietly in the gray pre-dawn light and made his way downstairs to the kitchen, The coffee ritual felt different now, less like a mechanical routine and more like a deliberate act of connection with the rhythms of the farm that had shaped his father's life. As he waited for the coffee to brew, he found himself looking out the window toward the cluster of outbuildings where the workshop waited in the growing light. Scout joined him at the window, the dog's presence solid and reassuring. Together they watched as the Nebraska sky lightened from deep purple to rose to pale gold, revealing the landscape that Roberto had looked upon every morning for 40 years. Michael tried to see it through his father's eyes, to understand what had kept a man of obvious artistic sensitivity tethered to this demanding, unforgiving life. The answer came to him gradually as the sun climbed higher and the details of the farm became visible in the morning light. This place was not just a business or a means of survival, it was a canvas, a medium for expressing the same creative impulses that had found outlet in the hidden workshop. Roberto had shaped these fields and tended these buildings with the same patient attention to detail that he had brought to his wood carving. The farm itself was a work of art, created over decades of careful stewardship and constant refinement. The straight fence lines, the well-maintained buildings, the careful rotation of crops that kept the soil healthy and productive, all of these were expressions of the same aesthetic sense that had guided Roberto's hand when he carved tiny whales and intricate jewelry boxes. Michael had inherited not just a piece of property, but a masterpiece of agricultural art, a landscape painting rendered in corn and wheat and prairie grass. After breakfast, Michael returned to the workshop, but this time he approached it not as an investigator seeking evidence, but as a student preparing to learn from a master teacher. The carved figures and unfinished projects were no longer just artifacts of Roberto's secret life. They were textbooks, lessons in patience and skill, and the transformation of raw materials into objects of beauty and meaning. He picked up one of Roberto's carving knives, feeling the weight of the handle in his palm. The tool had been shaped by years of use, worn smooth in exactly the places where Roberto's fingers had gripped it most naturally. It was an extension of his father's hand, a conduit for the creative energy that had found no other outlet in his carefully controlled life. Michael had never attempted wood carving, had never shown interest in any form of artistic expression beyond the childhood drawings that Roberto had remembered and treasured in secret. But as he held the knife and examined the unfinished pieces scattered throughout the workshop, he felt an unexpected stirring of curiosity. What would it feel like to guide a blade through wood, to coax form and meaning from a shapeless block of oak or pine? He selected a small piece of basswood from Roberto's carefully organized stock and settled at the workbench. The wood was soft and forgiving, ideal for a beginner's first attempt. He had no plan, no design in mind, but simply began to cut away small shavings, following instincts he didn't know he possessed. Scout settled nearby, his watchful presence a source of comfort as Michael fumbled through his first tentative experiments with the knife. The work was harder than it looked, requiring a delicate balance of force and restraint that Roberto had made seem effortless. But gradually, Michael began to find a rhythm, his movements becoming more confident as he discovered the pleasure of shaping wood with his hands. Hours passed without his awareness, the morning light gave way to afternoon sunshine, and still Michael continued his patient work.
He was not creating anything recognizable, just exploring the possibilities of the medium, learning how the wood responded to different angles of approach and varying degrees of pressure. But in the process, he was discovering something profound about himself and his connection to the man who had raised him. The capacity for this kind of focused, meditative work had always been within him, dormant but present, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The same qualities that had made him an effective soldier, the ability to remain calm under pressure and attend to minute details, translated perfectly to the demands of woodworking. Roberto had recognized this potential in his son and had been preparing a space where it could flourish, even though Michael had shown no conscious interest in developing such skills. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Michael set down the knife and examined what he had created. It was nothing more than a roughly shaped bird, crude and obviously the work of an amateur. But it was his first step into the world that Roberto had inhabited in secret, his initial attempt at speaking the language of creation that his father had mastered over years of solitary practice. He looked around the workshop with new eyes, seeing it no longer as a museum of missed opportunities, but as a living space waiting to be inhabited. The tools hung ready for use, the workbench stood clear and inviting, the stock of carefully selected wood waited patiently for skilled hands to give it purpose and form. Roberto had created not just a workshop but a legacy, a gift that would continue giving long after its creator was gone. The realization that he could continue his father's work, could learn the skills and develop the aesthetic sense that Roberto had cultivated in isolation, filled Michael with a sense of possibility that he hadn't experienced since childhood. This was not just about woodworking or artistic expression, it was about connection, about finding a way to honor the love that had been present all along but never properly acknowledged. Michael spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring every corner of the workshop, cataloging projects and examining tools with the eye of someone who was no longer just visiting but planning to stay. The unfinished cradle drew his attention repeatedly, its incomplete state a silent invitation to continue the work that Roberto's failing health had interrupted. The cradle was more than just a piece of furniture, it was a symbol of hope, a physical manifestation of Roberto's faith in the continuation of the family line and the possibility of healing relationships across generations. Michael had no grandchildren to place in the cradle, might never have children of his own, but the act of completing it would be a way of honoring his father's vision and keeping alive the hope that had motivated its creation. That evening, Michael made a series of phone calls that would reshape his immediate future. He contacted his landlord in Colorado to explain that he would not be returning to his apartment. He called the few contacts he had in the veteran services community to let them know of his change of address. Most importantly, he called the funeral home to discuss arrangements for Roberto's memorial service. Father Martinez had been planning a simple graveside ceremony, assuming that Michael's attendance would be brief and perfunctory. But Michael found himself requesting something different, a service that would reflect the complexity and depth of the man Roberto had actually been rather than the limited public persona he had maintained. He wanted to speak about his father's artistic legacy, to share with the community some sense of the creative spirit that had been hidden for so many years. The funeral director was puzzled by the request. Roberto Torres had been known in the community as a quiet, practical man, respected for his work ethic and reliability, but not particularly noted for creative pursuits. Michael's description of the workshop and its contents came as a revelation that would undoubtedly surprise many of the mourners who thought they had known Roberto well. Michael realized that he was not the only person who had misunderstood his father. The entire community had seen only the surface personality, the careful mask that Roberto had worn to protect his more vulnerable inner self. The funeral service would be an opportunity to introduce people to the artist who had lived among them unrecognized, to celebrate the full scope of a life that had been far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined. As night fell over the Nebraska prairie, Michael sat at the kitchen table with Scout beside him, planning the details of a life he had never expected to live. He would keep the farm, not as a burden inherited from the past, but as a foundation for building something new. The workshop would become the center of his existence, the place where he would learn to speak the language of creation that Roberto had never been able to teach him directly. The decision felt both momentous and inevitable, as if he were finally stepping into a role that had been waiting for him all along. The restless energy that had characterized his adult life, the sense of being perpetually displaced and searching for purpose, was beginning to settle into something that felt remarkably like peace. Scout seemed to approve of the new direction. The dog had been more relaxed and content since their arrival at the farm than Michael had seen him in years. Like his master, Scout was discovering that he belonged in this place, that the open spaces and purposeful work of farm life suited his temperament in ways that urban existence never could.
The days that followed passed in a blur of activity and discovery. Michael threw himself into the work of truly understanding the property he had inherited, exploring not just the workshop but every building and field with the eye of someone who intended to stay. He discovered that Roberto had been a better farmer and a more skilled manager than his modest lifestyle suggested. The financial records, once Michael located and deciphered them, revealed a man who had lived well within his means and accumulated substantial savings through decades of careful planning and disciplined spending. Roberto had been preparing for his son's eventual return in more ways than just the creation of the workshop. He had structured his financial affairs to make the transition as smooth as possible, had maintained detailed records of farm operations, and had even researched modern agricultural techniques that might appeal to a younger, more technologically inclined operator. The discovery of Roberto's business planning felt like finding another layer of the love letter he had been writing to his absent son. Every aspect of the farm had been organized and maintained with Michael's potential involvement in mind, from the updated equipment that would be easier for a newcomer to operate to the crop rotation schedules that were documented with unusual thoroughness. Michael found himself marveling at the depth of his father's preparation and the faith it represented. Roberto had spent years getting ready for a reunion that might never occur, optimizing every aspect of the operation for the benefit of a son who had shown no interest in farming and had never indicated any intention of returning to Nebraska. It was an act of hope so profound that it took Michael's breath away. The workshop became his classroom and sanctuary, the place where he began each day and ended each evening. He set himself the task of completing the projects that Roberto had left unfinished, starting with the simplest pieces and gradually working his way up to more complex challenges. The carved animals and decorative boxes became his teachers, showing him techniques and approaches that he absorbed through careful observation and patient practice. His hands, accustomed to the precision required for military equipment maintenance, adapted quickly to the different but related demands of woodworking. The skills were transferable in ways he hadn't expected, the same attention to detail and tolerance for repetitive work that had made him an effective soldier serving him well as he learned to shape wood with increasing confidence and skill. Scout established himself as the workshop's official supervisor, claiming a spot near the workbench where he could observe Michael's progress while remaining alert to the sounds and activities of the farm. The dog's presence was comforting and grounding, a constant reminder of the partnership and loyalty that had sustained them both through the challenges of military service and the difficult transition to civilian life. The community's response to Roberto's memorial service exceeded Michael's expectations. Word of the workshop's existence had spread quickly through Cedar Falls, and the small church was packed with neighbors who came to learn about the artistic legacy of a man they thought they had known completely. Michael displayed several of Roberto's finest pieces at the front of the church, and the gasps of surprise and admiration that greeted their unveiling confirmed his decision to share this hidden aspect of his father's life. Father Martinez spoke eloquently about the mystery and complexity of human nature, about the danger of assuming we understand the people closest to us, and about the gifts that can be discovered when we look beyond surface appearances. Several community members approached Michael after the service to share their own memories of Roberto, stories that revealed glimpses of kindness and thoughtfulness that had gone largely unrecognized during his lifetime. Mrs. Hendricks, who lived on the neighboring farm, mentioned that Roberto had quietly repaired her fence after a storm the previous winter, refusing payment and asking only that she not tell anyone about his help. Tom Bailey, who ran the feed store in town, recalled Roberto's habit of buying supplies for struggling neighbors and having them delivered anonymously. These small acts of generosity painted a picture of a man who had cared deeply about his community, but had been too modest or too uncomfortable with attention to let his charitable impulses be known publicly. The funeral became a celebration of complexity, an acknowledgement that Roberto Torres had been a man of many layers, some of which were only now being revealed and appreciated. Michael found himself serving as interpreter and guide, helping others understand the artistic legacy that his father had hidden for so long, and explaining the significance of the workshop to people who had never suspected its existence. In the weeks that followed the memorial service, Michael settled into the rhythm of farm life with surprising ease. The physical demands of the work, the connection to land and weather and growing things, satisfied something in his nature that had been dormant during his years of urban living. Scout thrived in the open spaces, his professional alertness softening into the more relaxed vigilance of a farm dog with territory to patrol and purposes to serve. The workshop remained the center of Michael's emotional and creative life, but it was no longer a secret space hidden from the world. He began welcoming visitors, sharing Roberto's story and displaying the remarkable collection of carved figures and furniture that represented his father's artistic legacy. Word of the workshop spread beyond Cedar Falls, attracting attention from collectors and museums interested in American folk art. Michael found himself becoming the curator of his father's reputation, the guardian of a body of work that deserved recognition and preservation. But more than that, he was discovering his own capacity for the kind of patient meditative work that Roberto had pursued in solitude. The unfinished pieces became collaborative projects across time, conversations between father and son conducted in the language of wood and steel and careful attention to detail. The cradle was the first major project he completed, spending weeks studying Roberto's design and techniques before attempting to finish the intricate carving work that his father's failing health had interrupted. When he finally placed the completed piece in the farmhouse living room, positioned to catch the morning light from the east window, he felt a sense of completion that went far beyond the satisfaction of finishing a woodworking project. The cradle represented continuity, the connection between past and future that Roberto had envisioned when he began its construction. It was ready now for the grandchild who might someday sleep within its embrace, a gift of love and hope that transcended the generational boundaries that had seemed so insurmountable during Roberto's lifetime. Michael's transformation from reluctant inheritor to dedicated custodian had not gone unnoticed in the community. Neighbors who had initially viewed him as an outsider preparing to sell out and move on, began to see him as Roberto's true successor, someone who understood and honored the values that had sustained the Torres family for 3 generations. He was invited to join the farmers' cooperative, asked to serve on the church board, and welcomed into the informal networks of mutual aid that kept rural communities functioning. The integration felt natural and inevitable, as if he was slipping into a role that had been waiting for him to mature enough to appreciate its demands and rewards. The restless energy that had characterized his adult life was channeling itself into purposeful work, the same combination of planning and physical effort that had sustained Roberto through 4 decades of farm management. Scout had become something of a local celebrity, his military bearing and obvious intelligence making him a favorite among the children who visited the farm with their parents. The dog seemed to understand his role as ambassador and educator, patiently tolerating the attention while maintaining the alert professionalism that had made him such an effective working dog. As winter approached, Michael found himself looking forward to the season of shortened days and indoor work that would allow him to focus more intensively on developing his woodworking skills. He had plans for new projects, ideas for pieces that would honor Roberto's memory while expressing his own emerging artistic vision. The workshop would be his university for the coming months, Roberto's tools and unfinished works serving as his teachers in the ancient craft of transforming raw wood into objects of beauty and purpose. The evening routine had evolved into something that felt sacred and sustaining. After the day's farm work was completed, Michael would spend an hour or 2 in the workshop, practicing techniques and working on projects that challenged his growing skills. Scout would settle beside the workbench, his breathing steady and calm, while the sounds of creation filled the space where Roberto had labored in solitude for so many years. On this particular evening, as snow began to fall outside the workshop windows, Michael set down his carving knife and looked around at the space that had become the center of his transformed life. The tools hung in their designated places, the workbench stood ready for tomorrow's projects, and the shelves displayed both Roberto's completed works and Michael's own first attempts at artistic expression. He had come to Nebraska to bury a father and dispose of an unwanted inheritance. Instead, he had discovered a legacy of love that had been waiting for him to develop the wisdom to recognize it. The workshop was no longer Roberto's secret sanctuary, but a bridge between past and future, a place where the conversation between father and son could continue through the medium of patient craft and careful attention to beauty. Scout rose from his spot beside the workbench and moved to the door, his signal that it was time to return to the warmth of the farmhouse. Michael turned off the workshop lights and followed, but he did not lock the door. The space was no longer hidden from the world, no longer a secret that needed protection. It was a working shop where meaningful projects were underway, and where the legacy of Roberto Torres continued to grow and flourish in the hands of the son who had finally come home. Outside, the Nebraska snow continued to fall, blanketing the farm in pristine white and promising the quiet season of reflection and indoor work that lay ahead. Michael stood for a moment in the yard between the workshop and the farmhouse, Scout patient beside him, and looked up at the stars that were barely visible through the thickening clouds. He had found his place at last, not by running toward some distant goal, but by discovering the value of what had been waiting for him all along. The farm would endure, the workshop would continue to produce objects of beauty and meaning, and the love that Roberto had been unable to express in words would live on in the work of their hands and the patient continuity of care that connected one generation to the next. Scout nudged his hand gently, reminding him that warmth and comfort waited inside the house where 3 generations of Torres men had wrestled with the challenges of love and communication, and the eternal human struggle to leave something meaningful behind. Michael followed his faithful companion toward the lighted windows of home, carrying with him the tools and the wisdom and the profound sense of purpose that his father had bequeathed to him in the secret language of creation that they had finally learned to share. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.